All righty. Well, we should have folks starting to trickle in. So let me just start by saying welcome to the AI and Media webinar. My name is Nicole Metro. I am a Vice President of Emerging Technology at V2 Communications, and I am so excited to dig into all things AI today with my wonderful panelists, who I will allow to introduce themselves in a second. But as was mentioned in the description of this webinar, now is a crazy time for AI. It feels like every company is trying to be an AI company, or if they're not, they have to talk about AI at some point, right? So wanted to pick the brains of John and Tom here to ask them about, what they're seeing as members of the media as it relates to AI and figure out how other brands can really stand out amongst the noise. So why don't we start, John? Do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm John Reed, co-founder of Diginomica, and we look at the realities of transformation in the enterprise, and so AI kind of fits into our rubric where we're really sensitive to the hype, but we're also really trying hard to document the worthwhile use cases, and I find myself sort of, you know, kind of in a love-hate thing with the topic in general, but definitely have turned it into a major focal point of my research just because it's just a really profound thing that impacts everything, including the businesses that you and I are in. And so I feel like I need to dig into this in a way that I never really did with things like webinar or blockchain. I mean, I did spend some time on those topics, but AI, I would say probably spent, I don't know, 4,000 hours studying it. And I still feel like a beginner, to be honest with you.
Tom, how about you?
So I'm a professor primarily, but most of my writing is intended to inform practitioners rather than other academics, which sadly makes me unusual as a business school professor. But at the moment, I'm primarily at Babson College. I'm a visiting professor at UVA, Darden School at the moment, and have an appointment, a minor appointment at MIT, and I'm a senior advisor to Deloitte. And my AI journey, I guess I did AI stuff back in the late 80s, early 90s, although I don't remember too much of it. Um, and I came back to it through analytics to big data to AI, which is, effectively the same thing in many ways. But I've been writing stuff on AI now, 6 books and more articles than anyone would want to read since 2015, I think. So I agree with John that I have a love-hate relationship for AI, but you certainly can't drop it at, at this point. It's a little bit strange to see so many people who never thought anything about AI all of a sudden decide that they're interested and indeed expert in it. People who think it was invented 2 years ago last week.
Yes, that's right. It's hard to believe it's been 2 years since that anniversary of ChatGPT that really forced everyone to start to talk about AI all of the time. Well, thank you both for the introductions. I think we've established you're both the experts to help us navigate this crazy AI marketing media landscape that we're in. So, I want to start by just asking, how many pitches are you getting a day on AI, and how many are you actually opening and reading and doing something with?
Go ahead,
You
John.
want
Did
to
you
you want
count?
to start? Go for it.
I would say 2 or 3 a day on average, maybe more. I don't really count them. And those, I still get a number of pitches that don't have anything to do with AI, even though AI is pretty much all I write about. So, and I just before this webinar, I did a quick search of myself to see how hard would it be for a PR person to find out that I only do stuff on AI these days, and turns out not very hard at all. So not a whole lot of research is going on in that regard. So, but anything about AI, I'll sort of, maybe read and think about a bit, although I don't really pursue the ones that are about some sort of so-called expert who can tell me about it. I don't really write about experts. I write about what companies are actually doing.
Hmm. John, what about you?
Unfortunately, it's around 25. I did a count. Um,
Yikes.
I don't read them all, but I do read a fair amount of them, and I have a bit of a classification system. Uh, Essentially, either you go into a top category, which I mean to follow up on at some point, or a semi decent category, or you get archived. Even if you get archived, you might come up on search at some point, so it's not a completely devastating setback. Uh, as far as the top ones, I would say out of 25, maybe three or four go in there. Some of those that get into the top category have useful data in them, though one of
Mm.
the phenomenons in the current AI market is what I call AI dissonance, which is that there can be data backing up almost any point of view, which actually makes the data part even more confusing and not always useful. Although that's kind of where I try to help companies is to parse conflicting data. But anyhow, so I would say in terms of a pitch that I would actually respond to that day and say, yes, let's set up an interview, probably about 1 in 100, to be honest with you. Um, so I'm pretty particular. I've got a pretty strong agenda in terms of what I want to do next, and so it's kind of hard to get that immediate. But even the stuff that goes into top, I do refer back to that and follow up on some of those. So it's not like 1 in 100 doesn't mean the other 99 get ignored forever. I'm just saying in terms of like action today, like you have my attention. Let's set this up. That's actually probably twice a week. Maybe that happens.
And what is it that gets you to say, you know what, I got to do something with this ASAP. I can't just file it away for later.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, like I said, some of it like is stuff that lines up with my always evolving research agenda. But I think a lot of times there's going to be one of the big themes will be that they've read my work and understand what I'm trying to do. That's not always the key because sometimes a shot in the dark is the right shot. But in general, if they understand my work, that helps.
Hmm.
Uh, Pre-existing relationships do matter, right? So there's a difference between a warm email and a cold if we've had success in the past, obviously. But I think the biggest thing is if they're providing access to someone with a unique point of view that I should be paying attention to, and especially if it's something that feels a little different than everyone. Like so, for example, like if a company offers up a CEO, that might be useful, but a lot of times my questions are too technical for a CEO to answer. And then it just really depends on whether I feel like I'm being blasted by something that no doubt most of my colleagues have received also. But generally, if someone can take me under the hood or show me something interesting or introduce me to a customer where we can really talk about projects, I can get into that more later.
Yeah, that's great. And I think interesting, Tom, you're kind of the reverse, right? I mean, you said it's less for you an expert voice or unique point of view, but more what's a company actually doing? Can you talk more about that and kind of how you qualify if a company is the right one to talk to?
Sure. It's usually, Nicole, if somebody mentions that some new capability, or I think it's new in enterprise AI, which I don't really deal so much with consumer AI, and they don't usually say whether the organization they are pitching has any customers or not. So if something sounds interesting, I'll send back a quick email saying, sounds interesting. Do they have any customers who might be willing to talk? I'm really only interested if somebody's actually using it already. And, I realize that there may be startups who have a great idea but don't have customers yet. If somebody wants to write about them, that's fine, but I don't generally. So, and then there's this sort of back and forth with the PR person. Do they really have customers, or is the customer willing to talk? Are they willing to go on the record with what they're doing? And that ends up filtering a lot of them out.
Hmm. It is the toughest part of our jobs, I think, is finding those customer sources for you guys. I mean, John, what about you? Are customers important to you? You seem like you're more technical and interested in the product than the use case. Is that true?
No, I would say it's sort of a balance between the two.
Mhm.
I'm a balance between pushing the technical envelope on what's possible, and the customer. I'll get back to the technical thing maybe in a later question, but on the customer side, I'm definitely interested in results, business case, business outcomes, and of course, with some of the generative AI stuff, as Tom alluded to, it's not mature enough in a enterprise setting to actually speak with a customer that's gone live. But there are times where that can happen. If it's not gone live yet and they can't speak to results, I might not want to talk with them yet. But it depends a little bit on exactly what they're undertaking. But one of my favorite examples happened about a year ago where I heard from a vendor that was promising me like they had a service bot that had absolutely no hallucinations. And that those are strong words because the LLMs, by the way they're designed, are simply not able always to discern fact from non-facts. So it's a strong statement. So I said I will talk with your customer about it, but what I required was that I talk to the customer without them on the call, which is a little bit unusual because usually I will let a vendor sit in on a call, but in this case I did not because the crux of the matter was they were kind of bragging about their hallucination capabilities, and so I needed to be able to ask the customer directly about that without any pressure that they might feel on the call from having the vendor looking over their shoulder, right? And so it ended up being a really productive, I think, quality use case around sort of what they were able to do with this company. It was a smaller insurance company with a generative AI service chatbot. And, while, I didn't go out and say, oh, this means you can do this without hallucinating, I was able to kind of validate that they're having success with this tool and that largely it's deflecting first party support inquiries, which, by the way, is one of the I think more credible early generative AI use cases in the industry right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And we can all agree that that kind of external validation, particularly when you're working with an AI vendor, is so important. Are there other voices that you both look for besides customers to give that third-party validation? Is it analysts? Is it other academics like you, Tom? Is it, folks, are you getting those in pitches or do you have to source them yourself?
I don't really get anything that references other academics. Maybe that should send me a message that I'm doing the wrong kind of work as an academic. But I tend to be interested in the sort of broader issues than just what can the technology do. I'm interested in the sort of organizational changes involved, the business impacts, as John suggested. So. If it's a really good pitch, it will mention some of those things. Um, I'm not so much interested in, giving more exposure to Gartner analysts or something like that. So I don't really respond if they're just mentioning an analyst or even if it's just a CEO of some company that I never heard of. I probably won't respond to that.
Hmm. What about you, John?
So I have like a kind of a network of people that I trust inside and outside like our industry that are expert in AI and long-term practitioners. And I also spent a lot of time on YouTube listening to like deep dives from some of these experts, people like Jan LeCun. I probably listen to every single one of his presentations. For example, he's at Facebook. But I learn a lot from expert practitioners. I don't learn a lot from quote unquote analysts, I would say. Though, I do enjoy swapping stories with analysts, and I go to a lot of analyst meetings at vendors and stuff. So I do enjoy that dialogue, but I learn the most from folks who get knee deep into it. And just as an example, I just published a piece that is SAP related today, but the theme that was not SAP related was I was on the show floor and I asked a vendor to demonstrate essentially this issue of LLM accuracy where there's a technique called RAG that's trying to control that accuracy by providing things in what's called the context window. So essentially you're telling the LLM like don't serve up what you feel like you want to talk about, serve up the data that's coming in. And the value there is that there's a lot of interesting use cases you can get into around, for example, in this case, users were questioning around HR policy. And so they wanted to know, can I travel to this event? Is this within our expense policy? And you want those answers to come from very specific documents, and for explainability, you want those to be there. And so the whole demo was about to what extent can we break the LLM? And so I'm sitting there, we're asking questions like, can we travel by helicopter? And we're trying to, because I want to see exactly how much control they've asserted on this technology versus LLM's tendency to kind of freelance on their own. And these are really, really important questions for enterprise customers, especially in compliance related regulated industries and stuff. So that example kind of illustrates to me like how someone can get my attention, which is to put me in front of experts and really walk through things and let me see for myself the tools. And it's really shocking how few pitches invite you to actually try something out. And I'll do that. I'll be like, let me try your tool out. Let me try your bot out. And it's usually a resounding silence after that. And I'm like, well, if your technology is not even ready for me to play around with, then what are we doing?
Hmm. That's a
So
great
did it
point.
say no to the helicopter?
It did. Yeah. It
Too
and the thing,
bad.
well, yeah, well, right. I mean, I'm not sure that would have been a much fun flight because that would overseas flight on the helicopter there. But anyhow, like the cool thing about it was that the specific answer said basically that this is not within the instructions that I received so essentially it's a prompt based instruction to only follow these particular documents. And so I was very pleased to see how much control had been asserted there. Now, does that mean that there will never be a mistake? No, and that's not the point. But the point is, you know, enterprises really need to understand the level of accuracy they can achieve in certain scenarios and to what extent they can actually limit that because they don't need an LLM to be able to answer every single question under the sun all the time like Gemini tries to do or whatever and gets into so much trouble as we've seen in the headlines recently. So I really like to try to document and bear down on that and so, if you can get me under the hood like that, then I'm going to write a story about it.
Hmm. I love that. That is so great. And I think, just recapping kind of the things that will help people stand out here, it sounds like obviously for you, John, giving you that like under the hood look, not just getting a technical person in front of you to give you that under the hood, but also playing around with it yourself is really important. And for both of you, the actual business use cases, how is it being leveraged? Who's leveraging it? What success or hurdles are they faced with? What about news? I mean, and I wonder, Tom, for you, you probably, I don't know, maybe you do get pitch news, but is it often product news, AI executive appointments? How do you handle that sort of thing and kind of filter through that if it's not of interest to you? Or is it?
It's not generally of interest to me. I mean, I might learn something from it, but I doubt I would write anything about it. It's kind of, I think of a lot of the AI news as sort of, like the latest polling results from political candidates. It doesn't seem like it matters all that much anymore. It doesn't predict the outcome very well, and so I just don't really get interested in those horse race kinds of things. And so much now of the LLM related news is horse race kind of stuff. So and so is a little bit better at this now, and I just don't really pay that much attention to it.
John, how about you?
Yeah, I do pay some attention to it though. I won't write about like what Tom's talking about, like the horse race news of like, oh, we just released this feature on this model or whatever. I really could care less about stuff like that. But I'm more interested in providing context, like and keep in mind, not everyone is the same. Like even at Diginomica, we have different writers that write on AI, and we have some other really good writers who touch on this topic a lot, who do things a bit differently than me, and that's fine too. That's the whole point. But for me, like I do pay attention to news in a certain sense, which is that news can influence enterprise perceptions of technology. So, for example, the sensational Gemini thing around, recently telling a student doing their homework that they should go kill themselves. Well, that affects enterprise perceptions of these tools. And so it's relevant for me to provide commentary on that in the extent of like, to what extent could this happen in an enterprise AI context? And generally speaking, why it's if the proper AI project design, you would probably be able to avoid that kind of thing. And there's an element of newsjacking that I do at times because if a story is kind of hot and interesting, it does provide an angle into the topics I want to talk about. But I'm really coming back to what distinguishes a successful project from a failed project, and that's really ultimately my goal. So in that sense, I'm not very news driven. I do think there are, however, media members that are much more news driven than me.
Mhm. Yeah. You also touched on earlier, John, at a point that I think a lot of companies can relate to, which is the influx of data about AI. And every vendor wants to put out a research report. I know I speak for myself when I say it's a great tool that we use very often for a lot of our clients, but is that interesting to you both? How often are you receiving vendor research reports? How do you decide which data is worth writing about? All of that would be certainly helpful feedback.
I find them somewhat interesting. I don't write about them all that often, but um, they have certainly influenced me, my thinking, my writing occasionally. Um, in this kind of environment, surveys, with things changing so rapidly, surveys are shallow, but they are about the only way you can really understand the kinds of changes involved. And I'm really more interested in changes in the workplace and how it's being affected by technology. So if something is about that, I might well pay attention and mention the survey at some point.
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of surveys suffer from the fact that they tend to be vendor sponsored, which implies some level of agenda, and a lot of times they suffer from things like small sample sizes and just wildly conflicting results. Like if you and I and Tom all went on Google right now, we could probably find a bunch of different surveys that said, "Oh, AI adoption is like, 70+% in most companies," and then you'd find other surveys saying, only 1 in 10 workers are using these tools every week, and parsing all of that stuff is pretty difficult. But the one thing I will say in my case that is important to me is I do get to a lot of events and I get on airplanes. And when I go to those events, I don't just talk with the customers the vendor lines me up with. I head over to the lunchroom and I sit at tables with the typical customer that has typical things on their mind. And lo and behold, AI is hardly ever the number one priority for these customers. And when they do want to talk about AI, it's in the context of some problem they're trying to solve usually. Which so I have this sort of baseline understanding of my industry based on what I see, and then I kind of contrast the data to that because the data's all over the place, to be honest with you. But I do think it can be interesting, and I will dig into it a little bit. But it would be really, really rare for me to write a piece just on a survey because there's just not. We don't have enough quote unquote truly independent surveys in our industry that would justify that. But I might touch on it in the context of a piece. I mean, I just in our weekly thing today, I just wrote this thing around a survey on why C-level executives are so much more excited about AI than the typical worker. And I think there's some really interesting discussion to be had there. So if it provokes a good discussion, then that's good. But it's I never treat it as like a definitive result.
Hmm. I think that's really good advice, especially looking at the differing opinions within a survey. You did mention sample size. What is the best sample size that people should be looking for? That's like, what's a threshold for both?
Look, I mean, it's really hard to say, but some of these surveys, 200, 300, 400 executives, that's just really not enough. And then you have to keep an eye on regions too, right? Because, AI is an international game.
Mm.
One of the things I really get wary of in a press release is here's the data that shows this problem. And by coincidence, we have the solution to this problem. Would you like to talk to such and such executive about that? And that to me is like not a great way to handle survey stuff. I much prefer it when it's more open ended and set and like, does this provoke some discussion on this topic? And shouldn't we be rethinking certain things? But when it's a coincidence that your survey led directly to your solution like that, that's when I start to struggle.
Mm.
Yeah, I just received one this morning about a comparison of different countries' AI infrastructure spending, and it was mildly interesting, but number one was Singapore, and then you look at the data and it's as a percentage of GDP. And yes, Singapore is definitely hitting above its weight, but I think no one would say that it's bigger than the US or China in terms of its influencing the use of AI around the world. So you have to be very careful. A lot of the surveys that I'm most interested in involve data and analytics and AI leaders in companies. And for that, 2 to 300 is a pretty good number because there just aren't that terribly many of them, more now than there used to be. But that would comprise a pretty good sample size for that target audience.
What about verticals? Is that, are there any specific industries that you're monitoring and would want data or perspectives on right now as it relates to AI, or is it kind of all over the place?
Well, I'm a fan of vertical approaches because I think what customers really want right now is how to apply this to your industry. I think they've heard enough about the revolutionary potential of these technologies, and I put revolutionary in quotes there. They want to understand how to apply it. So I'm definitely when you drill into industry with me, then I get more interested. And so in Diginomica's case, some of the industries we spend a lot of time on are things like retail, manufacturing, public sector, professional services, things like that. Some in healthcare as well. I find retail fascinating. I write about retail a fair amount, and I think what's super interesting about retail, is in the case like there's only really one or two companies, I would say mostly Amazon, that you could say, well, let's attribute a lot of their success to AI and automation. I think with a lot of other retailers, they've invested a whole lot of money in this, but they're still kind of struggling in a lot of ways, which I think is really instructive as far as, how quote unquote revolutionary a technology is outside of a business context. And but I enjoy learning about retailers, and one of the interesting things is they're trying to solve a problem, which is how do you serve a customer that's generally smarter than your employee in terms of like what's going on with your products, and they want service on all these different channels and locations, and they don't want any disconnects. And if AI can help with that, great, but that's not the only thing that can help with that. And so they want to solve a very specific problem, and the same thing with supply chain visibility in the back end of all that. And so I really like retail and industry conversations in general because it really like kind of puts AI through the grinder a little bit in terms of how is this actually relevant.
I have to ask, did you get a lot of holiday shopping
Oh
AI
yeah,
super chat
absolutely.
pitches?
Absolutely. I mean, and I'll occasionally get like real, like wishful thinking kind of stuff as far as like, stuff your Christmas stocking with AI kind of things. And that's really off my beat. But yeah, I mean, obviously this is a big time of year for that. So a ton of Black Friday stuff and everything else. And I'm still sorting that to try to figure out like if there's anything interesting from all of that data. And I really like Tom's example of trying to drilling into that global study because I think that's what the best people in our field do is they look at that and say, "Hey, let me dig into that and figure out like what does this really mean, right? Why are these Singapore levels high?" And if you do that and then you bring that into a public discussion, I think that can get pretty cool.
Tom, what about you? Specific vertical markets you're interested in right
Um,
now?
yeah, I'm really not that interested in any particular industry other than healthcare. I think that AI has a tremendous amount of potential benefit to offer healthcare. The unfortunate thing about healthcare is we read a lot about various breakthroughs in labs, but then my question is, okay, anybody using this at the bedside, in a clinical practice context, and hardly anybody is yet, for a variety of reasons. There are regulatory reasons, there are, conservatism on the part of doctors and nurses, there are issues related to will payers pay for it? But I'd love to see more about real changes in how care is administered through AI and related tools, but you just don't see very much of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think definitely a challenge that a lot of our health tech specific clients face too, actually. Well, we talked about a little bit the time of year, so I want to shift gears here and get your opinions on 2025 because it's coming up very quickly. What are the big AI topics that you both are interested in? What do you want to explore? What's kind of the next ChatGPT, LLM, Gen AI craze, if you will?
I don't think agentic is going to come up in this conversation at all, so I don't even want to mention it. No. Um, Obviously, everybody's crazed about agentic.
Hmm.
Um, Different people have different meanings for it. Different people think it's coming at a different rate. I think it's interesting. Is it going to revolutionize life as we know it? I'm not so sure. I do not think we're ready to sort of take humans out of the loop yet in many cases. And that's the perspective that I get when I talk to companies about it generally. Some people say maybe at some point, but agentic is a big one. And it's really hard to see what even rivals it. I think people are sort of frustrated with the fact that Gen AI typically benefits from having a human around, and so they want to get rid of them. And agentic is what promises that, at least, conceptually.
John, how about you?
Well, you can't get away from agents, right? I got a big chip off my shoulder with my piece on why are AI agents being hyped to the point of absurdity, and I was really frustrated by the really like willy-nilly, I think just lazy use of the term when it has so many different meanings and connotations, and it doesn't really help customers at all. But I think I'm not a big fan of like trying to predict the future. In fact, every year, Brian Summer and I, we write our predictions to kind of make fun of the whole predictions industry because I just don't. If you think you know what's coming, I think you need your head examined. Sorry, but I do think that the things that I will be focusing on is, I mean, generative AI is really just one sort of stream of AI. And so I'm really trying to understand the entirety of the field. And there's so many different components of that, whether it's facial recognition or digital twins or, governance, scale is going to become an issue with a lot of these things. Like, how do you manage these things once you have 10 or 20 or 30 agents? You have management issues. So a lot of the enterprisey concerns around security factor in. But I'm going to be really looking at results because I think we're going to start to see a little bit of results around some of the newer tech as the year unfolds. And that will be very interesting to see where those results are coming from. Now, results are different than ROI, and that's a really important point. Because a lot of the costs for this technology is still a moving target. I do spend a fair amount of time looking at new approaches because I have a little bit of an agenda that I would like to see a more decentralized version of AI emerge that is less dependent on massive big data and massive scale because that ends up kind of fueling the dominance of a handful of oligarchs that are making decisions about our lives without a whole lot of regulation, by the way. I'm tracking a lot of sort of decentralized AI trends. I did a piece on active inference AI, for example, and other technology approaches that are really deriving inspiration once again from the human brain, which is like we don't always need massive amounts of data to learn something. I mean, you put your hand on a hot stove, you don't need to do that 1,000 times to know that that's not a good idea. So there's different kinds of research being done that really fascinates me. So I do a little bit of that on the side, but I have to be a little careful because that's obviously not enterprise ready stuff. But the reason I do it is because I want to provoke people into realizing that there's so many fascinating unanswered questions around quote unquote AI, and that what you're consuming commercially today is not necessarily going to be where we end up.
Yeah,
Well,
no, I agree with that. And I think it's you said you read Jan LeCun stuff a lot, and I sometimes tire of him saying, well, generative AI is just auto-regressive. It's not any big
Right.
breakthrough. No, don't nothing to pay attention here, folks. Keep moving. But he does, I think, bring up alternatives, and same with Gary Marcus.
Yep.
Whose work I admire. And I'm very interested in, a lot of people have sort of dismissed um, previous pre-generative forms of AI as, traditional AI or heritage AI or legacy AI. But I see really interesting combinations of those
Yep.
older types and generative AI. Even rules, believe it or not, are still around in a lot of organizations, and you can get interesting combinations of rules and algorithms in some applications. So I'm very interested in the whole collection of AI-oriented stuff and in reminding people that if they have a certain type of data and they want to, make decisions better rather than generate content, um, generative AI is not the thing for them.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of very interesting stuff going on with so-called neurosymbolic AI and attempts to bridge the gap between what you described, classical AI. So I think this is really important, and enterprise leaders need to, I think, dedicate a little bit of their headspace to understanding that there's new stuff coming that could change things. But I also agree with Tom's point, like it's it's not really relevant to dismiss like generative AI either. The reason like Jan LeCun kind of I think does that is because he's in search of like AGI, though he would not use that term, but he wants these major breakthroughs, and he's not really looking so much at the commercial deployment of generative AI. Whereas I do spend a fair amount of time on that too, because there are things that can be done to improve the current technology and all the stuff around RAG and context windows and knowledge graphs and different ways to create more of a factual validation and updating of these systems. So I try to balance it out because I don't know. I think we should chase what interests us, and that should interest our readers. And if the PR people come along for the ride, that's great. I mean, one thing I did want to say, Nicole, is that I hope it didn't sound too adversarial with PR because some of my best stories come out of these kinds of relationships. And so those who take the time, I think, to invest in this are going to see a payoff in terms of better coverage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it didn't. I think this is what is so important about having conversations like this is understanding how do we improve what is supposed to be a very symbiotic relationship between PR people and media, particularly on a conversation and topic like AI that is so noisy. But my main takeaway from that, John, is that, and everyone listening to, we will not pitch you predictions this year ever again. I promise. I will make that promise on behalf of all of us listening in
No
today.
worries. I have a Gmail filter for it anyway, so it'll
Yeah,
just
I
go
have
in
to do
there.
some predictions. So if you have a really great prediction, I would love to
Oh,
steal it. But
alternatively, Tom, we'll send them your way. We were going to send them to
okay.
John. We'll send
And
them your way instead.
by the way, John, please tell Brian Summer I said hello. I used to work with him years ago at Accenture, Anderson
Oh,
Consulting
cool.
was known at the time. Yeah.
I'll let him know this week. I'm going to be talking to him later. Thanks, Tom.
Love that. Um, I'm curious, do either of you use AI at all in your, jobs? Do you use it for content generation, for searching anything? Do you use any vendor tools too that you've actually written about?
Well, I use it in my teaching, certainly for better or worse. I tried it this year for the first time in grading, and it was, I think, typical of generative AI. It produced a lot of text about the presentations that the students had done. Um, it was not particularly astute in terms of the grades it assigned. I generally gave higher grades. Maybe that's human grade inflation. I do use it in research occasionally. Um, just, I think yesterday, the day before, I'm writing a book chapter and I've kind of reached the limits of what I can think of to say, but the chapter's not quite long enough. So I said, "Oh, what would you say about this issue of analytics and AI in marketing organizations, and where the shortcomings, and why don't we have better one-to-one marketing after 30 years or so of talking about it?" And I think it gave me, as usual, it gives you a bunch of sort of bullet points. It gave me one, I think, that I wanted to explore. But I don't use it to actually write the stuff. I just use it to maybe give me some ideas.
John, how about you?
So, at the moment, at my last count, Diginomica is the only, well, there's three publications. We were the second, I think,
Hmm.
maybe the first, I can't remember, to announce that we weren't going to use generative AI for any of our article writing. And that was just a stance on reader trust. It's not to say that it would never like ever be relevant, but we just felt we had to set a very high bar with reader trust and human created written content. We do not have the same ban for like an image because like we have to have like photos with every article, and there's a heavy reliance on stock photos for things like that. Which let's face it, I mean that's just not a real value add to an article. I prefer to, when I do interviews, to use my own photos, but like I won't use AI photos either, but some of my other contributors do, and there's not a rule against it. I'm fanatical about that people should be compensated for their creation, and too many creators have been like incredibly exploited by these technologies and not received a dime. And so, not that you receive a whole lot of money from a stock photo license credit or anything like that, but I'm just kind of a stickler for those things. In my own work, I long ago adopted things like Grammarly
Mhm.
for writing review. I wrote a book where I used Grammarly and Pro Writing Aid and didn't actually use a human copy editor. I still need to at some point have a human copy editor proof it and see how good that was. And then um, Otter for machine transcripts. And most of that is not because they're better, but because of the expediency of it, right? If I'm finishing something at 3 a.m. in a hotel room, I really don't want to wait for a human editor to review it. So a lot of it is like expediency more than value add. But I will say the big value add one is, and I've written about this on Diginomica, is I evaluated a bunch of AI video editing tools because the problem in enterprise technology is take a webinar like this today, interesting for people who watch it live, but maybe not everyone's going to want to watch an hour long replay. Wouldn't it be cool to have a handful of highlight clips? Well, video editing is labor intensive. So, anyway, after a bunch of them, I actually use a service called Opus Clip when I do my live shows, and it slices and dices it and comes up, I think, a lot of times with some really good highlight clips. Is it as good as what I could do? Probably not, but in that case, I wouldn't have time to do it. And so, I think that kind of stuff is interesting. And I think AI is really good at things like summarization, which is effectively what that is. And it does a great job.
Yeah, that
Oh.
reminds me, I use it a fair amount for images,
Hmm.
particularly sometimes in presentations, fairly commonly in presentations. Last week, I had to give a presentation about a Harvard Business Review case study that I had written about an Indonesian bank with a female CEO. And I said, generate me an image of a wise, thoughtful female CEO from Indonesia who's facing a question to be addressed, and it did a fantastic job. And I'm not sure that I could have found a real example of a stock photo that was as good. And yesterday I was writing a piece about the Navy and a new approach to procurement that they've used, and I needed a picture of a sailor with a lot of technology boxes on his desk, and it did a pretty good job of that too, I would say. So uh, oddly, I found it, even though I'm mostly a words guy, I find it better for images in many ways.
Do you have any systems, and this might be relevant, specifically for you, John, with Diginomica, that you run pitches or commentary that you get from companies or PR people through, like to see if it was ChatGPT generated or another tool generated?
Not really, to be honest with you, because I wouldn't be offended if someone gave AI a go for like writing a pitch for me. Like I'm gonna judge the pitch on what I believe is the merits of the pitch. Now, one thing that would really bother me is if I felt like I was interacting with the bot, if I sent like a follow-up question
Hmm.
and then it felt like a bot was answering my questions about the pitch, that would really be a deal breaker for me. But to be honest with you, and I hope this doesn't sound too mean, it's pretty hard sometimes to tell the difference between the average human PR pitch and an AI pitch. They're all laden with the same techno, optimistic buzzword bingo stuff and, revolutionizing this industry and all this stuff. So a lot of times, like it would be really hard, I think, to tell the two apart. And I don't really care if you get the right pitch to me and hit me at the jugular with what you're doing. If AI helps you to do that, the more the merrier. I would just say that the danger there is I think AI is usually used to expand scale and scope. And that to me is like volume fishing. And I don't think that works for enterprise content because enterprise content is more about reaching the right people with the right content. So I'd be really careful with that. Like, so for example, in the HR space, you hear about people using AI tools to apply to 5,000 jobs instead of 20. And there, the numbers game totally makes sense, right? I mean, they're already using these tools to filter you out anyway. So why wouldn't you do the same thing? But pitches are a little bit different than that, and I think PR people need to really think hard about whether they're playing a numbers game or a relationship game. And if they're playing a relationship game, they can use AI, but they would want to use AI to say, take a look at this guy's last 100 articles and construct to me a pitch that would be relevant to him based on those articles and much more customize it versus like send this pitch to every, enterprise reporter on the planet, which I don't think is going to work very well.
Totally.
Right, but nobody does that. I found they will mention an article, but it's one article that they
Yeah.
looked at or something, not the whole collection of recent ones. The other thing I've found is that there is so much marketing or technology marketing content that these systems are trained on. They don't tend to be very accurate or objective at all. I have my students, for example, talk about different AI use cases, and I noticed the last time I did it that all the ones who wrote about healthcare would mention how IBM Watson is a dominant force in healthcare AI, which it never really was, but God knows there was a lot of marketing to the effect that it was dominant or going to be curing cancer, et cetera. And the LLMs don't really realize that never happened. And IBM
No.
sold off Watson Health a number of years ago, but it just hasn't caught up.
Yeah, it's fair to say that these AI systems were not trained on the writings of Gary Marcus, who is, by the way, a college classmate of mine.
Oh, really?
And I would recommend all PR folks on the call to read some of Gary Marcus's Substack work because he presents a very bracing perspective that you would not encounter in your enterprise techno-optimistic jargon travels that you experience in your daily life. And I don't mean that completely as an insult because optimism is a part of getting the work done that we need to get done. It's just that there's other perspectives out there. And I'd really encourage you to look at Gary's stuff. Now, Gary is not invested in like the kind of stuff I've been talking about as far as like Gary wouldn't be that impressed that a service bot dealt with a lot of first level support inquiries because he's not focused on enterprise use cases. He's got bigger fish to fry around policy and the future of like society and stuff. But the point is, it's good to get those views, and I would encourage PR people to just read a little more widely than what you're getting from your clients, and I think that will really help you when you're dealing with journalists to talk their and academics and stuff to talk the language they want.
It's such a good point. Yeah, there's nothing worse also than I would assume on your end you got on the call with a PR person and they don't actually know how to talk about the technology itself that they're trying to pitch, which is not
No,
great.
and a lot of times they haven't read my stuff, and I'll send them a link to like an article that I published last week on the same topic, and it's just kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if we have a future, the two of us.
A bad date.
Yeah, it does. It feels a little bit like a speed dating gone wrong.
Oh, don't love that. That is total cringeworthiness for me, and I think my fellow PR folks on the call. Before we get to our final thought, and I want to, get to some of the questions in the chat too, but we talked about what it takes to get you interested in a pitch, the right kind of angles to approach, but what about guiding the spokespeople? And you mentioned the technical piece, John, but you get on the phone with these customers or executives or whoever, are there common mistakes you see those folks making that ultimately lead to you not wanting to write about them or include them in a story?
For me, it's that their communications people take way too long to sign off. I try to
Mm.
say in every case, I'll show you what I plan to write. If I made a mistake, by all means, correct it, etc. But some of them literally take months, and by the time they get back to me, I'm not really interested anymore. It's really quite annoying.
Hmm. What about
I
you,
feel
John?
for that. I feel for that. Diginomica, we don't do that. We don't do it. Just I want to make that clear in case anyone gets excited about getting approvals from us. We never do that. It's just part of our independence that we have to maintain as a media outlet. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, like Nicole, like the mistakes are made before the interview is set up because
Hmm.
if you get the right person on the call, then it's usually going to go okay. I mean, look, I mean, there's always some margin for error, right? Where maybe things don't work out as fluidly. Like, so for example, in that demo I did on the show floor, I started with the CEO, and this always happens to me. 5 minutes in the conversation, let me call my chief AI officer over, right? Because we're starting to get like deeper into the weeds than they were expecting. And then I'll probably go back to them at the end and start talking about business value and outcomes. So, but they really need that technical person there for some of the under the hood questions. So, a lot of times, what I try to do is to help PR people understand like the kinds of things I'll be covering to make sure the right people are on the phone, but or
Mm,
on the meeting or whatever. But once the right people are on the call, generally it's fine. I mean, just in general, I think it's just more that people crave openness and transparency, and readers really want to understand like the challenges that companies faced and the inevitable difficulties and how those were overcome, and companies can be really afraid of that. They kind of want to be like, oh, this changes everything, and but in fact, like when you dig into these projects, there's a real readiness component, and there's a lot of heavy lifting around data transformation, data quality, metadata, all that stuff, and these aren't easy things to deal with, and so honesty around the whole picture really matters. And I think some vendors shy away from that, but they shouldn't, because in every project has its moment of truth and its gut checks. And it's all about how you overcome that and the strength of that relationship. And actually that ends up reflecting really well on the vendor. So as long as people can talk to me about that stuff, then we're great. Once the slide deck comes out and we're halfway into a slide deck, Tom joked that he was going to have 50 slides for us today. I hope that's not the case. But but
I
that
wanted to start right now.
but once the slide deck comes out, then we're heading down a bad road.
that is good advice. I think that tends to be people like having something visual to help guide their conversation, but
Unless it comes up during the conversation, in which case, okay, let's go to slide number 10 or whatever.
yes.
But just starting out with the deck is by the time the problem what people don't realize is by the time you're done with the deck, your brain is done too. You're tuned out. You're just like you lost the engagement.
Yeah, it's not a conversation, it's a presentation then, right? So pulling at one of the questions from the chat, this is interesting. Are there any tech moments in history that you would liken to what we're seeing with Gen AI and agentic AI? Like any other technologies that really drew this much attention, debate? Can we tie that to AI? What do you think?
Well, the internet comes close, certainly, and the whole .com explosion in terms of numbers of companies and stock values and so on. That for a while didn't seem like it ended well, but I think it really changed life as we know it in many ways. And if I think if AI changes life to that degree, it'll be a huge success.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I did a piece on productivity because I wanted to make fun of the idea that they were having these massive productivity gains because of these tools. And in fact, productivity rates haven't really gotten a big bump since the initiation of the personal computer in I think it was like late 90s when those gains started, early 90s when those gains started dropping off again. And it was the conversion to manual. So we have to be careful about patting ourselves on the back about productivity in particular historically, because for example, things like indoor plumbing had a much bigger impact on productivity than AI so far. But in terms of like the cultural political impact, I'm not sure that we've seen anything to this extent. Business impact's a little bit different, but cultural impact and just the profound implications for society, for jobs, ultimately for how we live and work. I think this is maybe the biggest thing, but it's a little more of a slow burn than some people realize. Like this is gonna take a while to play out, but as it does, I do think it's an absolutely necessary conversation to have, not just about business, but about life, the future of humanity, the relationship between humans and technology, and what kind of AI ultimately do we want to have and what will serve humanity better. I think is a profoundly important question. So I would agree there. But in terms of like impact on the enterprise, I think a lot of parallels could come from adoption of mobile phones and smartphones, where
Mhm.
the consumer impact really drove enterprises to rethink a lot of things in terms of how bulky and clunky and inaccessible their software was. And to some extent, the same is happening with AI, where it's really poking holes in a lot of enterprise UIs and showing how, stilted they are compared to just asking a prompt a question and getting an answer. But I actually think this is the enterprise's chance for redemption because a lot of the problems with AI are the things that enterprise is actually really good at. So instead of being a laggard in a bad way, the enterprise can chime in on things like security, threat management, uh, making sure that the results are accurate and auditable, explainability, which is a huge problem with these systems still. Like, so the enterprise has a chance to redeem itself for being slow, and I really hope it does because that I would find that encouraging and useful.
Love that. Okay, so final question that I have for you both, and I think there's been a lot of different AI terms coined in the last few years, in large part thanks to ChatGPT. But 2023 was really called the year of AI hype. It was just after ChatGPT came out. So then 2024 has been called the year of AI reality, which we can probably debate whether or not that was true. But what do you think 2025 will be? And yeah, John, I'm going to make you make a prediction here. AI, what's it going to be? The year of AI, what?
I'm deferring to Tom first. I want to hear his prediction.
Well, it really needs to be the year of AI production deployments. I think 2024 was better than 2023 in that regard. At the beginning of 2024, my survey data suggested, 5 or 6% had a production deployment. I just saw some data yesterday suggesting in large organizations it's maybe up to the 23% range, but that's not enough if we're going to get any economic value from this technology. So we either need to sort of put up or shut up on this thing and get some real value.
Yeah, I can't add much to that. I mean, I feel like I want it to be the year of AI results, but I
Mhm.
fear that that's going to be a subtext to the year of automagical agentic automation and, and how humans fit into all of that. We'll figure that out later. Uh, and I think that's sort of the wrong direction. So it'll be interesting to see. But I do think we'll see more results, and I'm kind of pulling for that because that's where we can really learn how to make this stuff work. So I hope we do.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. We really appreciate the time. This has been such a fun and productive conversation and very interesting and enlightening for me, especially, and hopefully for those of you that are tuning in. If you've tuned in, thank you. And please let us know if you have any questions and follow up for any one of us on the call here today. We're happy to answer them. And if you are interested in learning more about V2 and what we can do to help make you stand out in the crowded AI market, please, feel free to reach out to me as well about that. John, Tom, thank you again. We will talk soon.
My pleasure. See you.
Thanks, everyone. Both already.
Sure.
Awesome. Let's get this started.